The snow didn't just fall, it pressed. A cold, white hand trying to crush my little cabin, trying to squeeze the last bit of warmth out of the world. For 7 winters, I'd felt that pressure. 7 winters since my husband James died. And with every year, the silence inside these 4 walls got louder. You might think silence is quiet. It's not. It's a noise all its own. It's the creak of a floorboard when no one's walking. It's the whisper in your ear right as you're about to fall asleep, reminding you that you're alone. Utterly and completely alone. That silence followed me into town, too. But there, it was mixed with other sounds. The sharp, cutting whispers of the other women. They called me strange, cursed, the widow Whitfield who drove her own husband to an early grave with her cold heart. They'd watch me trade my dried beans for a pittance of flour, their eyes like little chips of ice. I learned to pull my shawl tight, to hide my face, to make myself small. It was easier to be invisible than to be seen. Tonight the blizzard was a monster, a roaring white beast swallowing the whole valley. My cabin was just a tiny speck, a single flickering candle against an entire universe of cold. I watched the flame dance, and I wondered if I'd just flicker out too, remembered by no one. And then I heard it. A sound that didn't belong, not in a storm like this. Hoofbeats, heavy, slow, fighting through the deep snow. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. No one would be out in this. No sane person anyway. This was a night for dying, not for traveling. I crept to the window, rubbing a small circle in the frost. 2 figures on horseback. Tall shadows against the swirling white. They moved like ghosts, their hair long and pale, catching the moonlight and looking like it was made of frost itself. They were broad, wrapped in thick buffalo hides, and they moved with a purpose that scared me more than the storm. My mind screamed all the old warnings. The stories they tell you as a child, wild men, savages. But my heart saw something else. It saw 2 men and their horses about to be swallowed by the snow. It saw 2 souls about to be extinguished. And I knew, deep down, that I wasn't so far gone that I could just stand here and watch death take them. When the knock came, it wasn't a bang. It was a soft, steady rap, a sound that wasn't demanding. It was waiting. I pulled the door open just a crack. The firelight spilled out onto 2 men. One was older, his face a roadmap of hard lines, like a canyon carved by wind and time. A streak of perfectly white hair was braided down his chest. The other was younger, his eyes dark and deep, holding a stillness that seemed to defy the storm raging around him. "Storm," the older one said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "Shelter." The word hung in the air. Shelter. Such a simple thing. Such an impossible one. I thought of the town, of what they'd say, that I'd opened my door to Apache. They'd spit my name in the dirt. They'd call me fallen, tainted, an outcast for good. But the wind howled behind them, a scream that sounded like the truth. And the truth was, without my door, they wouldn't see the morning. I stepped aside. "Come in." They moved past me into the small cabin, their weariness so heavy you could almost touch it. Snow melted from their boots, leaving dark puddles on my floor. Without a word, they unstrung their bows and sheathed their knives, placing them carefully by the door. This wasn't an invasion. It was a surrender to the storm. I leaned back against the door, the wood cool against my trembling shoulders. The elder touched his chest. "Taza." He then gestured to the younger man. "Nantan, my brother." I swallowed, my throat dry. "Eleanor," I managed to say. "Eleanor Whitfield." They just nodded, as if names were all that was needed. I pointed to the fire, and they knelt before it, stretching their frozen hands toward the flames. I moved like I was in a dream, filling a pot with water, adding the last of my dried corn. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The cabin was just one room. Every sound was magnified, the hiss of melting snow on their coats, the low murmur of their voices as they spoke in their own tongue. I kept my back to them, staring into the pot of corn mush, but every nerve in my body was aware of them, aware of their size, their silence, their sheer presence in my tiny, empty world. When I served them, Taza bowed his head, a simple gesture of thanks that felt monumental. Nantan's eyes met mine, just for a second, and in that second, I felt something crack inside me, like ice giving way in a spring thaw. I looked away, a hot flush of shame creeping up my neck. What was I thinking? They ate slowly, taking only small portions, as if they knew how little I had. When they were done, they returned to the fire. I sat across from them, clutching my cold cup, the silence stretching between us. But this wasn't my usual silence. This silence was alive. It was shared. "Long ride," Taza said, his English broken, but clear. "Snow heavier than sky should carry." "The storm won't break until morning," I replied, my voice a little stronger now. He just nodded. Nantan said nothing. He stared into the flames, but I could feel him watching. He saw everything. The way my shawl slipped, the way my hand trembled. It had been so long since anyone had truly looked at me. It felt like a wound and a balm all at once. I went to my loft to sleep, but I couldn't. I lay on my cot, listening to their steady breathing from below. It was a rhythm, a soft drumbeat of life in a house that had only known the sound of my own lonely heartbeat. For the first time in 7 years, I wasn't afraid of the silence. But when morning came, the world was gone, buried. The snow was piled high against the door, sealing us in. When I climbed down the ladder, the 2 men were already awake. They'd rekindled the fire. Taza looked at me, his face impassive. "Snow deep. Horses cannot go. We wait." They would stay. The storm had trapped us. Not just for a night, but for days, maybe weeks. And as I looked at Nantan, I saw him glance toward their saddlebags, which they had placed carefully in the driest corner of the room. He adjusted the leather flap, making sure it was secure. He was hiding something. And a new kind of fear, colder than the snow outside, began to creep into my heart. I hadn't just given shelter to 2 men. I had locked myself inside a cage with a secret. The days blurred into one long gray twilight. The snow was piled so high against the single window that only a weak, filtered light could get through. We were living in a box buried under the world. Taza took it upon himself to keep us from freezing. Every morning, he'd wrap himself in his furs and force the door open against the drift, his axe in hand. He'd disappear into the white fury, and I'd stand there holding my breath until I heard the rhythmic thud of the axe biting into wood. It was the only clock we had. He'd return covered in snow, his arms piled high with logs, and a quiet, unspoken gratitude would settle over the cabin. Nantan was the quiet one, but his silence was a language all its own. He worked with his hands, his movements slow and deliberate. He fixed the shutter that had rattled in the wind for years. He used a bit of resin from the pine logs to seal a crack in the floor. He never asked. He just saw what was broken, and he fixed it. He saw me. I'd find myself watching him. The way his long fingers worked a piece of leather, the way his eyes would scan the room, taking in every detail. He wasn't just looking, he was seeing, and under his steady gaze, I felt real, for the first time in a long, long time. The fear about their secret was still there, a little knot of ice in my stomach. I saw how they guarded their saddlebags, how Taza would sleep with one hand resting on them. What were they protecting so fiercely? Or what were they running from? One night, the storm was particularly vicious. The wind screamed like a dying animal, and the whole cabin groaned under the weight of the snow. I was sure the roof would finally give way. I must have made a small sound, a little gasp of fear, because suddenly Nantan was looking right at me. His expression didn't change, but he shifted his position by the fire. He moved just enough so that his body was between me and the door. A silent promise, a shield. My heart did a strange, painful flip in my chest. The next evening, Taza spoke. He told a story, in his rough English, about a mountain that touched the sky, where the snow never melted. He spoke of his people, how they learned to read the snow, to listen to the wind. It wasn't just a story, it was a piece of himself. When he finished, the silence returned, but it was different. Warmer. That's when Nantan finally spoke to me. Not about the storm or the cabin, but about me. "Why stay?" he asked. His voice was deep, and it seemed to vibrate right through me. The question hit me like a physical blow. No one had ever asked me that. They just assumed. The sad widow, too weak to leave. I looked into the fire, the truth a bitter taste in my mouth. "Because it's mine," I whispered, "and because there was nowhere else to go." He just nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. There was no pity in his eyes. There was something else. Understanding. And in that moment, the knot of fear in my stomach loosened, just a little. But that night, I had a dream. I dreamt of my husband, James. He was standing by the river, the way he used to, but his face was filled with worry. He pointed to the floorboards right by the hearth. "It's there, Eleanor," he whispered. "You have to find it, before they do." I woke up with a start, my heart pounding. The dream was so real, so vivid. The next morning, while Taza was outside and Nantan was tending to the horses in the makeshift lean-to he'd built, I went to the hearth. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers over the floorboards. Most were nailed down tight. But one of them was loose. I pried it up with the tip of my knife. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound journal. James's journal. My hands shook so badly I could barely open it. His familiar handwriting filled the pages. He wrote about his work as a surveyor. He wrote about the valley, about the lines on the maps. Then I saw the name. Silas Croft. The man who founded our town. The man who owned everything. James wrote about a great lie. A shadow over the whole valley. My eyes flew to the last entry. The date was written at the top. It was the day he died. Croft knows I have the proof, the original survey, the real map. It shows the treaty lines. This whole valley. It's a theft. They'll kill me for this. I gave a copy to the two brothers. They will know what to do if I... The ink trailed off. The two brothers. I looked up from the page, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. My gaze locked on the saddlebags in the corner. They hadn't come here by chance. They hadn't been running from the storm. They had been running to me. And the secret they were carrying, it was the same secret that had gotten my husband killed. My world tilted on its axis. James hadn't died in a riding accident, slipping on a patch of unseen ice. He'd been murdered. The man I had loved and mourned for 7 years had been silenced because of a map, and the men sitting by my fire were part of it. I shoved the journal back under the floorboard, my mind reeling. Did they know who I was when they arrived? Was this whole thing a setup? My fear returned, colder and sharper than before. Now it had a name. Croft. A family that owned the town, the store, the sheriff. A family James had called thieves. The storm finally broke a week later. The silence that followed was deafening. The world outside was a pristine, blinding white. It was beautiful and terrible. And it meant our time in this tiny cage was over. I knew I had to go to town. Our supplies were nearly gone. The thought of facing those people, their stares and their whispers, made my stomach clench. But we were out of flour and salt. "I will go with you," Taza said. It wasn't a question. "We both will," Nantan added, his eyes on me. I wanted to say no, to hide. Walking into town with 2 Apache men at my side would be like dousing myself in oil and walking through fire. But when I looked at them, at the quiet strength in their faces, I knew I couldn't refuse. I wasn't the same woman I was before the storm. I wasn't as small. The ride to town was surreal. The three of us moving through a world of white. Their pale hair, unbound, streamed behind them in the wind. They looked like kings of winter. When we reached the town, it was like a spell had been broken. Everything stopped. Men working outside the blacksmith's shop froze, their hammers silent. Women at the well turned their backs, pulling their children behind their skirts as if we were a plague. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were a low, angry hum. I kept my head down, my shawl pulled tight, and walked into Croft's mercantile. Jed Croft stood behind the counter, a younger, meaner version of the town's founding father. His eyes narrowed when he saw Taza and Nantan follow me inside. "What do you want, widow?" he sneered. "Flour and salt," I said, my voice barely audible. He moved with deliberate slowness, scooping the flour, his eyes flicking from me to the brothers. When I placed my coins on the counter, he looked past me, directly at Nantan. "We don't serve your kind here," he said, his voice dripping with venom, "and we don't like our women keeping company with savages." My face burned with shame. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. I grabbed my things and turned to flee. But Taza stepped forward. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, tall and unmovable, and stared at Jed Croft. Croft, for all his bluster, took a step back. We walked out into the cold air, but we didn't get far. Sheriff Brody was waiting for us. He was a big man, his belly straining the buttons on his coat. He was Croft's man, through and through. He tipped his hat to me, a mockery of respect. Then he turned his gaze on the brothers. It wasn't a casual glance. He was studying them. "You boys look familiar," Brody said, a lazy drawl failing to hide the menace beneath. "Lost your way, have you?" "We go now," Taza said, his hand moving almost imperceptibly closer to the knife on his belt. Brody's eyes gleamed. "I'm sure you do. Just be sure you keep on going. This is a decent town. We don't take kindly to strays." The threat was as clear as the winter sky. The ride back to the cabin was silent, but my mind was screaming. Brody hadn't just been threatening them, he had recognized them. As we neared the cabin, Nantan pulled his horse alongside mine. "He knows," he said, his voice low. "He knows who you are?" I asked, my heart pounding. Nantan shook his head, his dark eyes finding mine. "He knows who we are. He was one of the men with Croft, the day your husband died." The world went white again, but it wasn't the snow. It was the blinding, horrifying truth. I had spent a week in a cabin with the only witnesses to my husband's murder, and I had just led them straight back to the killers. I stumbled into the cabin, dropping the sack of flour on the table. The truth was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, stealing my breath. They weren't just witnesses, they were a target, and by taking them in, I had painted that same target on my own back. I turned away, pressing my forehead against the cold logs of the wall, fighting back a wave of nausea. Shame washed over me. Not for helping them, but for my own weakness. For all the years I had let the town shrink me, for the way I had just stood there, silent, while Jed Croft spat his poison. A floorboard creaked behind me. I didn't have to turn. I felt his presence. Nantan didn't say anything. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just stood there, a silent anchor in my storm. Then I felt a weight settle across my shoulders. Warm and heavy, his cloak. He draped it around me, a shield against a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I gripped the thick buffalo hide, the smell of wood smoke and pine filling my senses. It was the smell of him. The warmth seeped into my bones, steadying me. When I finally turned, his eyes were on me. Dark, unreadable but unwavering. In his gaze, I didn't see pity. I saw respect, and something else. Something that made my heart ache. That night, I couldn't pretend anymore. The journal felt like a burning coal under my floorboards. After Taza had settled into his furs by the fire, his breathing deep and even, I knew I had to speak. I met Nantan's eyes across the flickering shadows. "My husband," I began, my voice a ragged whisper. "He kept a journal." Nantan's stillness intensified. He didn't move a muscle, but his whole being was focused on me. He wrote about a map. He wrote about Silas Croft and a great lie. He wrote about two brothers. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Taza was not asleep. His eyes opened, sharp and alert in the firelight. He sat up slowly. "Your husband was a good man," he said, his voice heavy. "An honorable man." And then the story came tumbling out, not in a rush, but in steady, deliberate words from Taza, with Nantan adding a quiet detail here and there. James had been hired by the government to resurvey the territory. He was meticulous, honest. And he had found it, the original treaty, signed a generation ago. It showed that the Croft family's claim, the very foundation of the town, was based on a forged deed. The whole valley, from the river to the mountains, was Apache land. James had confronted Silas Croft, not with threats, but with the truth. Croft had laughed in his face. James knew they would never let the truth come out. So he made a copy of the real map and the treaty documents. He rode out to find Taza and Nantan's father, the chief of their small, displaced band. He entrusted the documents to them. "He told us to wait," Taza said, his gaze distant. "He said a time would come when the truth could be heard. He was going to take his evidence to the territorial capital." He never made it. "We saw it," Nantan said, his voice so low I had to strain to hear it. "We were watching from the ridges. We saw Croft and his men and the sheriff corner him by the river. It was no accident, Eleanor. They had the proof. The map James had died for. It was in their saddlebags. They hadn't been running from the storm. They had been coming here, to the wife of the man they had made a promise to. The blizzard had just been a coincidence, a sign from the spirits, Taza said, that their path was the right one. I looked from Taza's weary, honorable face to Nantan's dark, intense eyes. They had carried this burden, this dangerous truth, all this time. They had come here seeking, what? An ally? A hiding place? "The map your husband gave us," Taza said, finally reaching into the saddlebag and pulling out a heavy, rolled-up object wrapped in hide. "This is a death sentence, and now you are holding it with us." He didn't mean for it to sound like a threat. It was a statement of fact. I was no longer just the lonely widow. I was a conspirator. I was the keeper of a secret that could get us all killed. And Jed Croft and Sheriff Brody knew the only witnesses to their crime were somewhere in this valley. And they knew exactly where to look. The thaw came, but it brought no relief. Every patch of melting snow felt like an uncovering, a revelation of the dark, muddy truth beneath. The world was waking up, and so were its dangers. We were no longer just three people sharing a cabin. We were a fortress, a very small, very fragile fortress. The rhythm of our days changed. Every task was now weighted with a new urgency. When Taza chopped wood, it wasn't just for warmth. It was to strengthen our defenses. When Nantan repaired the fence, it wasn't just for the horses. It was to create a perimeter. And I was changing too. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but something else was growing alongside it. A cold, hard anger. They had killed my husband. They had stolen his life and built a town on a lie. For 7 years, they had let me live in the shadow of that lie, bearing their scorn while they held their secret. No more. The journal and the map were now hidden in a new place, a loose stone in the chimney that not even James had known about. Touching the worn leather of his journal, the stiff hide of the map, felt like holding my husband's legacy in my hands. It was a legacy of truth, and I would not let it be buried. The fragile peace we'd built was shattered one afternoon. I was outside, hanging a blanket to air in the weak sunshine, when I saw him, a lone rider, sitting on his horse on the ridge overlooking my cabin, just watching. He was too far away to make out his face, but I didn't need to. It was one of Sheriff Brody's deputies. They were watching us. I calmly took the blanket down and went back inside, my heart hammering. "They're here," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. Nantan was instantly at the window, peering through a tiny gap in the shutter. Taza simply picked up his bow and checked the string. The calm way they prepared for a fight was more terrifying than any shouting would have been. "They will not attack in daylight," Taza said. "They are cowards. They will wait for the dark." The waiting was the worst part. The sun crept across the sky with agonizing slowness. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sounded like hoofbeats. We didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say. We ate a cold meal of bread and dried meat, the food tasteless in my mouth. As dusk began to settle, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of purple and gray, Nantan came to me. He stood before me, his presence filling the small space. He reached out and gently touched a strand of my hair that had escaped my bun. It was the first time he had ever touched me so deliberately. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a shockwave through my entire body. "Eleanor," he said, his voice soft, "you do not have to do this. There is still time. You can leave. Go to the town. Tell them we forced you. They will believe you." I looked up into his eyes. In their dark depths, I saw a storm of emotions. Fear for me, a deep, aching sorrow, and something else. Something that looked a lot like love. The anger that had been simmering inside me finally found its voice. "For 7 years I have been running," I said, my voice shaking with a force I didn't know I possessed. "I have been hiding in this cabin, hiding from their whispers, hiding from my own life. I am done running. This is my home. James died for the truth. I will not dishonor his memory by running from it now." A flicker of something, pride, relief, danced in his eyes. He didn't smile, but the hard lines around his mouth softened. He took my hand, his palm rough and calloused against mine. "Then we will face them together." His hand in mine felt right. It felt like the end of a long journey, like coming home. As the last of the light vanished, Taza came to stand with us. He placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, and then he looked at me. "He has chosen well," he said, and the words were a blessing. Suddenly, a flicker of movement from the window caught my eye. Outside, in the twilight. But it wasn't on the ridge, it was closer, much closer, a torch, and then another. They weren't just watching anymore, they were coming, and they weren't coming to talk. They were coming to burn us out, to bury the truth and the three of us under a pile of ash and smoke. The orange glow of the torches danced through the gaps in the shutters, casting jerky, monstrous shadows on the walls of the cabin. It looked like the whole world outside was on fire. There were more than a dozen of them. I could hear their low, angry voices, the crunch of their boots in the snow, the nervous whinny of their horses. They were a mob, drunk on their own self-righteousness. Jed Croft was at their head, his face red and twisted in the torchlight. Sheriff Brody was beside him, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Eleanor Whitfield!" Croft's voice boomed, thick with false authority. "You've got one chance! Send out the Apache murderers and we'll let you live!" Murderers. The hypocrisy of it was so thick I could have choked on it. My first instinct was to hide, to shrink back into the shadows. But then I felt Nantan's hand tighten on mine. I looked at him, then at Taza. They weren't afraid. They were ready. Their calm was a fire that burned away my fear, leaving only a hard, cold resolve. I let go of Nantan's hand, walked to the heavy wooden bar that secured the door, and lifted it. The screech of the wood echoed in the sudden silence outside. I pulled the door open and stepped out onto the small porch. The cold air hit my face. I stood there, in my simple dress, my shawl wrapped tight around my shoulders, and I faced them. A collective gasp went through the mob. They had expected to be met with arrows and knives. They didn't know what to do with a lone, unarmed woman. "There are no murderers in this house," I said, my voice ringing out in the night, clearer and stronger than I had ever heard it. "Don't be a fool, woman," Sheriff Brody shouted, taking a step forward. "They've poisoned your mind. They killed your husband." "No," I said, my eyes locking on his. "You're wrong. I know who killed my husband." A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. Some of the men in the back started to shift uncomfortably. They were farmers, blacksmiths. They had come for a righteous cleansing, not a complicated accusation. "She's crazy!" Jed Croft screamed, his composure starting to crack. "The savages have bewitched her. Burn it down. Burn them all out." He raised his torch, and a few others followed suit. But before they could move, the cabin door opened wider. Taza and Nantan stepped out, one on each side of me. They held their bows, but the arrows were not nocked. They stood as still as the mountains behind them, their presence a silent, powerful challenge. The sight of them, tall and defiant, gave the mob pause again. This was it. The moment it would all break, one way or another. My mind raced, grabbing for a weapon, any weapon, not a gun, not a knife. I needed a truth they couldn't ignore. And then, James's voice echoed in my head, from the last line in his journal. The real map. It shows the treaty lines. The lines. "You talk about what's right," I called out, my voice soaring over their muttering. "Let's talk about what's right. Ask Jed Croft about his father's deed to this valley. Ask him why the survey lines are wrong." Jed Croft's face went pale. "Lies! She's spouting the lies they fed her." "Am I?" I shot back. "Or are you afraid? Afraid these good people will find out this town, their homes, their farms, are all built on stolen land? Land that belongs to the Apache, according to a treaty your own father signed and then buried." Silence. A thick, stunned silence. The men looked at each other, then at Jed Croft. The seed of doubt had been planted. They knew the Crofts were powerful, but they also knew the stories of how old Silas Croft had tamed this valley. Maybe it hadn't been tamed. Maybe it had been stolen. "This is our land," Croft roared, desperation making his voice shrill. "We built this town with our own hands." "You built it with a lie," I countered. "And you killed my husband to protect it." "That's enough," Sheriff Brody drew his pistol. "I'm arresting these two for the murder of James Whitfield, and I'm taking you in for aiding fugitives, Eleanor." He leveled the gun. Not at Taza or Nantan. He leveled it right at my heart. This was their plan. Silence me, and the story dies. But in that split second, as the hammer clicked back, something moved in the shadows behind the mob. A single rifle shot cracked through the night. Not from the cabin, from the trees. Sheriff Brody's pistol flew from his hand, spinning into the snow. He cried out, clutching his wrist. The mob spun around in confusion. And from the darkness of the woods, figures began to emerge. More Apache. At least 20 of them. They moved like shadows, silent and swift, their bows drawn, their faces grim. They formed a ring around the stunned and terrified townsmen. Taza and Nantan hadn't been running. They had been leading their people here. They had been waiting for the signal. The hunter had just walked into the trap. At the front of the Apache warriors was an old man, his face as lined as Taza's, his presence radiating an immense authority. He looked at Taza and Nantan, and then his eyes settled on me. "You are the woman who gave shelter to my sons," he said, his voice deep and resonant. Jed Croft and Sheriff Brody were trapped. Their mob had dissolved into a terrified huddle. Their power, built on lies and fear, had evaporated in an instant. The old chief stepped forward, picking up the rolled hide map which Taza had placed on the porch railing. He unrolled it for all to see. "This is the truth," he declared, his voice echoing in the silent valley. "And tonight, the truth has returned." Justice hadn't come in the form of a lawman or a judge. It had come on silent feet, with drawn bowstrings, from the very people the town had tried to erase. Nantan came to my side, his hand finding mine in the darkness. He didn't have to say anything. His presence was enough. The long winter was finally over. The thaw had come, and in its wake, something new was beginning to grow, something strong, something true. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more tales where the line between civilization and the wild gets blurred and justice is found in the most unexpected places.